Thank you for joining us today. We're waiting for a few more people to join and we'll start the presentation shortly. Thanks. Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Skill Gap is Real, How to Build a Learning Culture Within an Agile Organization. My name is Rebecca Dumashow. I'm the Director of Technical Product Marketing for the Stack Overflow for Teams project here at Stack Overflow. I am joined by Katy Tynan from Forrester. Hello, Katy. I'm going to let you go ahead and go through your background for us, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really lovely to be here. I am Katy Tynan, and I am part of the employee experience and future of work teams here at Forrester. So I cover what you would think of broadly as organizational development. I cover a lot of topics that are related to how we make the work environment a great place for individuals to do their best work, as well as a great place for organizations to get their stuff done. So it's a balance, and a lot of the topics that I talk about related to learning, related to culture, related to leadership, all have that common thread of how do we do this really well? So part of why I'm here today is to talk a little bit about that connection between upskilling specifically, how do we get better at the skills that we need to do our best work, and this world that we live in, which is agile, sort of in the way we talk about in the software development world when we talk about agile, but also agile in the way that things change a lot. And there's a lot of transformation that goes on and a lot of change that we all sort of operate under and in. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a little more about me. I'm certainly not going to read it to y'all, but you are welcome to come and take a look at some of the things I talk and write about at Forrester. And especially right now, I think there's a lot of stuff that's top of mind for organizations as they're struggling with some of these ways that work is changing, these trends and things that are happening in the world that just seem to shift what we do on a regular basis at work. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about our future of work research. And when we talk about the future of work, I think we think about it in a 3-year, a 5-year, a 10-year event horizon. We talk about these trends that we see that are shaping behaviors in companies. And of course, what happened in the pandemic is a lot of these trends became accelerated and some of these trends became more visible. So one of the shocks that we talk about is this idea of systemic risk, and how these systemic risks, so a pandemic, for example, is a systemic risk, but climate change is also a systemic risk, and cybersecurity risk is also a systemic risk, right? They're environmental factors that can come to play to impact how we do work, and we can't predict them. We can't make a nice tidy flowchart that says on Tuesday we're going to have a pandemic and then we'll know what to do about that. So systemic risk is part of this ecosystem that we live in. And we have to make sure that when we think about designing our organizations and our processes, that we're building in tolerance for and resilience to these systemic risks. We also see robots and automation. And I think this has been sort of the big narrative about the future of work that everybody's heard, this idea that robots are going to come and take all of our jobs. And that's just not our perspective. And probably for most of you who use automation and use robots on some kind of a regular basis in your work, that what we see is this is changing jobs, not eliminating them. And then we also see two other significant forces that are changing the way we work. One of those is workforce data. All of these new technologies, and you've probably seen some of them in your work, HR technologies, whether they're engagement tools or wellness tools or performance management tools or human capital management systems, right? We are just overloaded with data about the humans in the workforce. But we don't always know what to do with that data. We don't always have the right tools, the right solutions, and a lot of that data is private. There are security issues, and so that's a challenge. And then we also have, and we're going to talk a bunch about this later, this ongoing issue of rising employee power and rising in some places, falling in other places, but the dynamics between individuals and organizations is changing. Okay, so I just told you 100 things about the future of work. Now I'm going to tell you what that means to us in organizations. And the first thing I think that's important to think about the what it means is, what does this mean for how we're doing work on a daily basis? So typically in organizations, what we do is we have this sort of stacks of boxes model of jobs where we hire people into jobs. Your job has a job description and you do mainly what's in that job description on a daily basis. But as these kinds of environmental factors come into play that shift and change what we're doing on a regular basis, we can't be that static about how we allocate work. So we developed this model. We call it the no more jobs model here at Forrester. By that, we don't mean no more people. We just mean that the idea of restricting people to just what's in their job description is not always productive in terms of getting work done. And it's certainly not always productive in terms of making sure that you're leveraging all of the skills that your people have, the capabilities that your people have, and that you're preparing for the future. So what you see here is we're unbundling jobs into these constructive elements, business needs, projects, tasks, and then we're using some algorithmic matching processes to be able to say, okay, these things could be done really well by some sort of a bot or an automation tool. They don't have to be done by humans. And then these other things, well, they're really good things for maybe our contingent workforce, a freelancer, a contractor, or maybe even leveraging a gig platform to get something done. And then we have our workforce, and our workforce is our full-time employees. And those folks have certain skills. We need to really understand those skills, and we need to figure out how to get the right person doing the right work at the right time. And that's what gets us to our business outcome. So all of that is well and good on the business side of how we think about the workforce, but none of it works if the humans in the workforce aren't motivated and don't have the environment and the ecosystem they need to be successful. So I mentioned before that a lot of my coverage is about that piece. So for that, we like to look at research, and we do our own, but we also look at other people's research about what makes people successful, happy, and engaged at work. So one of the pieces of research we look at is this research that Google did back in 2007, where they really wanted to try and understand their high-performing teams. And so they took a good look at their organization and said, gosh, why do some of our teams outperform other teams? And when they did that, they thought they were going to find this answer. They thought they were going to discover that it had to do with the mix of personalities and the mix of skills, and that you could just have this mathematical formula, and that was going to result in a high-performing team. But what they found in the reality was quite different. So the first thing they found was that the number one thing that impacted how well a team performed was psychological safety. So whether the team felt safe to take risks, whether they could communicate honestly with one another, whether they felt like the culture around them was supportive of taking risks and potentially being vulnerable, that was the number one defining factor that separated the teams that performed well. Not the skills, not the capabilities, not the personalities, but the psychological safety. And so much of that is led by the leaders of those teams, those frontline managers. They also uncovered several other really important factors. And I show you these because as you're thinking about your teams and your organization, these are pretty good diagnostic thoughts to have when you're looking at a team that maybe isn't performing as well as you hope it would, or maybe there's friction and tension and you're trying to unpack and understand that. So the next one is dependability. Can people count on each other? Are they sure that the person sitting next to them is going to do what they said they were going to do in a meaningful way? It's also about structure and clarity, making sure that people know what their goals are, making sure that they know how to be successful. I always say when I'm talking to our clients that everybody needs to know how to win. Everybody needs to know every single day how exactly their work contributes to their own personal success from a performance management perspective, the success of the team, as well as the success of the organization as a whole. But unfortunately, when change is happening all the time and we're all sort of jumping from thing to thing and expectations are shifting, that clarity can get muddy. And sometimes we don't do a good enough job as leaders of coming back to and grounding ourselves and our team members in that clarity. What are we really trying to do here? What's most important today? And the outcome of that is, and probably a lot of you have felt this, we end up trying to do too much at once. We try to be doing everything that we could do instead of really narrowing the aperture to what are the most important things we need to do that have the most impact. And then how do we take some of these less important things off the plate so that we can do a much better job of the things that are on our plate? The other piece that's super important is the meaning of that work, right? Nobody likes to dig holes and fill them back in. Nobody likes to do work that feels inherently meaningless. And so sometimes we're going to do stuff that frankly is just routine. It's stuff we have to do, and that's fine. But the majority of the work that we do needs to have some kind of meaning underlying it in terms of how does this help someone somewhere with their life, with their job, with their personal stuff that's going on, whatever that ends up being. How do we connect that effort that we're making every day to some positive outcome for ourselves or for someone else? And then the last piece, which is really closely related to that meeting, is the impact, right? Do we think that it matters somewhere to someone at some level? So if we look at that as the research that Google did, and we think about those as good guiding principles for us, we then also here at Forrester do some of our own work, and we think about this in the form of employee experience. And you'll see when you look at this that there's some real similarities in what we see in our work and what Google saw in their work and what you also see from other research. So it's very consistent. And the reason I tell you this is because I think sometimes we tend to think of management theory as being just that. It's theory, it's nice ideas. But when we dig into it, a lot of this is just basic human behavior. We are human beings. We have certain needs. We have certain things that help us connect to the work that we're doing. And those things are pretty consistent. So when you look at all the things that change in our environment, you look at all those systemic risks, you look at all of the stuff that interrupts us from what we think of as our routine every day, we can ground ourselves in the idea that what leads to engagement and these fundamental principles of what makes work for people are pretty much the same, regardless of the work that we're doing, regardless of the ecosystem we're in. So the first piece is empowerment, especially when we're doing creative work. And I want to differentiate something super important here. In the past, when most of the work that people did, especially in the Industrial Revolution era, in factories, when work was repetitive and it was clearly understood. So you were doing something that you knew how to do and you could just do it over and over and over again. that it was less important for people to have empowerment and autonomy over their job. But over time, and especially when we look at tech work, when we look at development work, we're not talking about that kind of repetitive work anymore. We're talking about creative work. We are solving novel problems every day. And that kind of work is actually motivated very differently from repetitive work. So when we look at how we get people to be connected to that work, it's about having autonomy. It's about having choice and freedom and agency in how you do the work. And we often see that reflected in management theory when we talk about micromanagers who come down and tell everyone how to do their job instead of telling them what needs to be done and letting them figure out how to do their job. So there's just some really important elements here, I think, to think about in terms of how you as leaders create an environment where people feel like they have some agency in this. The second piece, which you certainly saw in the previous slide, is this idea of people being inspired by their work, right? Do I have a manager who understands and lives the company values? Do I believe in that core mission and value of the organization? Do I see that other people around me also believe in that? And are we together making some progress and having an impact in the work that we do? The last piece, which I think is sometimes overlooked in a lot of leadership theory, is this idea of enablement, that there's a lot of stuff we do every day, technology that we use, processes that we go through, meetings, all of these different kinds of things. And sometimes those things feel easy and help us do our work, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes the technology that we use or the processes or the systems that we use get in the way. And so a big part of creating an environment where people can be successful has to do with having them able to do stuff easily, having things resolved when they create friction in their environment. So I know we said at the top, and I am going to get to this, that we're here today to talk about upskilling, particularly in this world. But I wanted to set this context because upskilling and career development falls into the context of all of these things that we do to create an environment where people feel like they can be successful. So all by itself, just sort of going to your team members and saying, learn new skills, isn't that effective. But when the learn new skills message comes in the context of, hey, what do you need to do your job better? What are some of the gaps that you have in your ability to get stuff done? Are there areas where you feel like skills would help you? Or are there ways in which getting new skills helps you feel connected to and inspired by the work that you do? So that's the connection, and we're going to dig into that a little bit more. But I want to talk here a little bit about that context of why we think people leave their jobs. And we're going to talk more about this, by the way, when we start to talk a little bit in the chat. Rebecca and I are going to unpack a little bit of this great resignation narrative that's going on. But I want to start out by just debunking this idea of why people quit. So most companies think that people quit because of money. And certainly money is a factor, okay? So I'm not going to say that money does not matter. But money doesn't matter as much as we think, because when we look at exit interview data, only 12% of employees specifically say that they left primarily because of money. Now, we do see that people will take a new job because of the money they're being offered, but there are a bunch of other factors that play into it. And I think this is really important to consider as you're looking at your talent. The first piece is a lack of feedback. When we don't know how we're doing, and you can see how these tie to some of those engagement elements I talked about before. When we don't see opportunities to learn, to grow, and to develop, when we don't feel recognized for the hard work that we're doing. And this is a leading contributor, by the way, to burnout, which is a huge issue right now in the middle of the pandemic and the middle of all of these other things that are happening, that people feel like they're working really hard alone in the dark and nobody knows that they're doing that work. We also see that people lose trust in their employer or in their manager, and that can be a really strong reason why they look for another role. And that goes right back to that psychological safety piece from the Google research. And last but not least, just an overall sense of feeling overworked, of feeling burned out, of just feeling like there's too much happening and going on. So what does that mean for us as we're thinking about learning and how that applies to helping us retain talent, helping us have the workforce that we need, going back to that model that I showed you before about the no more jobs piece. So traditionally, when we look at learning, and especially when HR looks at learning, we look at learning in the context of the talent lifecycle. So when we go to attract talent, we are looking at what skills those folks have. Then we hire people, right? And then we see that maybe there are gaps between the skills and capabilities they have and what we really need them to do. As we onboard people, we think about that being a learning experience. And then we want to develop and grow that talent. And this is really the place where most organizations invest the most time, effort, and energy into their learning processes. And then we want to recognize and engage and ultimately potentially offboard folks onto their next endeavor, whether that's within the organization or outside of the organization. But as you can see here, learning typically only falls in one of these boxes as we look at the total talent lifecycle, and that's this development box down here. But what we know is that learning actually is something that needs to happen all the time. And it's not just formal learning, meaning I go and take a class or I go and read a book. It's that plus this idea of exposure, meaning I get to observe other people doing things, or I get to have a conversation with other people who are learning the same thing I am and talk about my progress. That's the 20%. But 70% of how we learn is trying and doing it on the job. And so this is where in a lot of organizations, this whole upskilling concept starts to fall apart, is because there's a tremendous focus on that formal learning element. How do we find time for people to take classes? How do we give them technology that helps them do that? But there's not enough consideration of how do we then take what they learn in that space and bring it to life by giving people stretch opportunities, allowing them to try new things in a safe way, having exposure to other people who are trying to do that kind of work. So how do we bring that learning to life? So as you're thinking about your upskilling strategies, it's important to go beyond just that formal learning piece of what are we going to learn in a formal setting and figure out how we're applying that on the job and how we're applying that to people's work. So we are seeing more organizations start to emphasize this idea of on-the-job learning. But the problem, I think, in a lot of organizations is we're not sure exactly how to make that happen. So that's something we're going to talk about a little more today, and Rebecca and I are going to unpack a little more as we get into this idea of how do we make that come to life for real on the job. So just as we're thinking about learning in that new way, coming away from the idea of just siloing it into formal learning experiences and into the development piece of our talent lifecycle, we start to think about it by putting the learner at the center. So instead of saying, this is what the company needs, go do it, we're really looking at the learner and saying, what does this individual need to be successful in their role right now today? What might they need in the future? And what might the organization also need in the future? And how do we align those things? So what that starts to look like is a personalized learning journey instead of recommendations that are pushing content at people or courses that we're sending people to, but really thinking about that personalized piece, that it extends outside the organization. So it's not just about what learning your company specifically offers, but also what learning experiences and journeys might exist beyond the walls of the organization, whether that's participating in some kind of a group or an industry association, whether that's taking some sort of a program or working with a mentor group. So there's a lot of learning experiences that go beyond just what we do in our day-to-day. We also want to try and connect learning to business outcomes, right? When we're asking for funding for learning, and we're going to talk a little bit about making that business case, we want to be able to draw a really straight line between this is a learning experience that is going to have a really positive business outcome too. And then we want to make sure that we're bringing people together in a community of practice. We're making learning part of our daily conversations in a lot of different ways so that people are in that mindset all the time of learning culture. And last but not least, we really want to ground our learning strategy in the science of learning. We have spent a lot of years pushing learning to people, but not necessarily understanding or applying the theory of how adults learn. And that means that a lot of our learning practices have not been as effective as they should be. So all of that I just told you boils down to a couple of important things. First of all, the idea that learning culture is an environment where we do that smart risk taking, which is dependent on psychological safety, by the way, that we're investing in those resources and that we are embracing this idea of continuous innovation. So learning culture is not just about throwing content at people and saying, go learn it. It's really about creating that environment and that ecosystem where learning happens all the time. And I'm going to quickly build through these slides so that I can talk about them all at once, which is we often think about closing the skills gap with just technology. So we say, okay, we have a skills gap. What we need to do is go out and buy some technology that's going to help us be able to deliver more learning. But as I just said, and I'm sure you understand, that just technology doesn't solve the problem. We also need managers to be coaches. Going back to what I said before about why people really leave their companies, it's because they're not getting that support, that feedback, that growth and development from their managers. But we also need time. One of the things we do is we run really fast all the time, and we don't leave enough space to step back and ask ourselves the questions, is this the right thing to do? Is there some way I could be doing this better? Or we don't build enough time in to say, I need to learn a new skill, which means I'm not going to be perfectly efficient in this thing that I'm doing until I practice it a few times. So being able to think about those three different dynamics in your strategy for closing the skills gap is super important, and going beyond just saying we need a new technology tool that's going to help us do that. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up, and then Rebecca and I are going to get into a little more conversation about this. But I just want to leave you with some thoughts. The first thing is this future of work thing. It's not so much the future anymore. A lot of these trends are affecting us and impacting us right now. And so it's not something that we can just play wait and see over. We also know that mature organizations are starting to spend more time and effort and focus on learning because they see that connection to business performance. And again, we know this idea of learning culture is important, but it's dependent and underpinned by these three big things: time, technology, and managers being good coaches. So we have this gap, we have this challenge, and we know that technology alone is not a solution. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm just going to open it up to Rebecca. And I know we're going to have some conversations now about some of these things and topics, and see where we go.
Thanks for that, Katie. And thanks so much for sharing how important learning is at work, both as an employee and as a manager. I know I see it every day. I think if we can go ahead and move into the next thing. Learning cultures aren't just about those traditional training classes that you go off for a week once a year and then come back, as Katie mentioned. Those kinds of trainings only account for like 10% of the learning process. Instead, learning cultures are made up of a series of micro learning moments. And we've seen that in our own research too, how much employees value learning. So they do want to learn. And if we go to the next slide, we can. So 56% of employees want their job to offer opportunities to learn. 53% would consider leaving a company for an opportunity to learn. That's pretty important statistic right there. 33% want their company to make it easier to find experts within the organization, and 40% want to learn from people outside their team. And all of those data points come from a poll survey that we conducted back in December. Your teams also have to learn. So 75% of developers say they have to learn a new technology at least every few months. So, this is an industry that's changing constantly. It's definitely one reason that I got into the tech industry, was that opportunity to keep learning. It wasn't going to be stagnant. There's always something new around the corner, whether it's a programming language or a tech stack. Definitely something to look forward to. When we look at scalable micro-learning moments, Stack Overflow for Teams enables developers and technologists to have daily micro-learning moments. So it helps them find solutions to problems that they're encountering right now. They're not passively reading like boring documentation on how to theoretically solve a problem. It's something that's staring them right in the face at the moment. They have async learning from subject matter experts. So they may not even know the subject matter expert in real life. They haven't met, didn't know their name, but they're able to find them through Stack Overflow for Teams. And then finally, they can build their skill set. So they're discovering those connections between technologies, techniques, or approaches that they haven't used before. And they're learning from people outside of their team. So we really see like kind of that breaking down of silos between different teams. Somebody on a different team may have the answer that you're looking for. All right, Katy. This is kind of one of my favorite questions right here. How does applied learning and learning through doing close skill gaps faster? I really think we should probably start off by defining what applied learning is.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it's so interesting to me because if you spend a bunch of time with folks who are in the academic side of the house, right, who are studying learning and adult learning theory and all of these things, there's a lot of research and data about how we learn. But in some ways, even prior to having technology to help us deliver learning, we had some really bad habits in the corporate world about learning. And part of it, honestly, was habits that we developed because it was convenient for scheduling. So think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you needed to learn something, what did you do? You went to a workshop. So you went away from your desk, you went to some space, whether it was in your organization or offsite, and you sat there with a bunch of your peers, and you probably got a big binder full of information, and you learned that thing in a classroom. And then what happened? You went back to your desk and your behavior didn't change. Nothing about your actual habits changed at all because we weren't connecting that learning to the work itself. And so then when we introduced technology to the process, I think what we did was we replicated that bad process. And we said, okay, well, let's just deliver content to people electronically instead of having to have them go away in the classroom. And somehow that will be better. And it wasn't better. So I want to talk about what good looks like for experiential or applied learning, first of all, and then we can sort of unpack how we do that. When we think about how we learn something new, and I always use the cocktail party analogy, right? If you walk into a cocktail party and you get introduced to someone and they say, hi, my name is Mary. And your first response is, oh, hi, Mary, what do you do? And they start telling you about what they do for a living. You've now lost their name. Their name is gone. And now you're embarrassed because you've completely forgotten their name. Why did you forget their name? Because it wasn't meaningful to you. You didn't apply it. You didn't use it. You didn't do anything with that data point. Now it's gone out of your head. The same thing is true about learning in our work, that if we learn something and don't use it, it goes away so fast because our brains are really efficient and they're like, nope, you don't need that. You're not using that. So we'll just let it go. So applied learning is about taking theory and doing something with it. And that something can be a wide range of activities. It might be talking about it in a learning community and saying, hey, I saw this thing. I've never tried it. Has anybody else tried it? What does it look like? It might be actually trying it and saying, okay, I'm going to try this new technique or this new process. And of course, most of the time, the first time you try something new, it goes horribly wrong, but you learn a lot about it when you're doing that. So that's what we mean by applied learning, is taking that theory, that fact, that tool, that technique, and actually doing it. And I use the head, heart, hands model when I'm talking about behavior change a lot of the time, that we need to know intellectually in our head what we're trying to do. We need to care why we actually need to do it differently, and then we need to do it. And that's when things start to stick. So that to me is what applied learning is really all about, is moving something from our head and our theoretical idea of how to do it to our hands of, let's try this, let's see what happens, let's find a way to make it stick and be meaningful to us.
So, I mean, you said a couple things there, Katy, that I kind of want to zoom in on. That old model of learning where you go off and you have a binder. I just had a flashback to like my ITIL like certification course. I definitely had some huge books from that. But one benefit of that at the time was that my coworkers couldn't reach me, right? Like I could focus on that training at that time. But as you said, if you come back and you don't use it, maybe it wasn't so helpful after all. What can companies do to implement and maybe even measure applied learning if you're not coming away with like, oh, I went to this course for a week, I came back with a certificate, I can hang it, on my cue wall or my home wall now since we're all working from home. How can companies kind of embrace that?
Yeah, so let's start with when we're trying to measure learning, what we're really trying to measure is behavior change. And so I think we beat around the bush on that all the time because that's hard. So when we're trying to measure learning, typically we use crude metrics to see whether people are consuming the content, whether they can pass a little quiz at the end, whether they enjoyed it, right? How many times have you taken an e-learning course and at the end of it, you get a little thing that says, hey, give this a rating, 5 stars. Those don't tell you whether that learning content was effective in helping you do something different, helping you learn a new skill. And so the first thing I would say that organizations need to do is think about how they're looking at measuring a learning experience. So if, for example, I wanted to learn a new programming language. Well, okay, the first thing that I need to do is go and potentially take a class or take some structured content to help me learn some of those skills and techniques. But then I need to be able to do it somewhere and use it somewhere. And the person who's actually closest to my ability to do that is my direct manager. And so this is where managers come in terms of being able to, whether it's team leaders directly, whether it's, you have a matrix management structure, right? Somewhere you have to be able to capture, hey, Katy learned this new thing, right? We hired her and she had these skills and now she has developed this new skill and I've seen her do it. And I've seen her progression over time, and I would rate her capability a 1, a 2, a 3, a 5, a 10, whatever, on that skill. That's an input that we don't always get. And it doesn't have to come from the manager. It can also come from a subject matter expert on the team. It can come from a colleague. It can come from a lot of different places. But that's meaningful data that helps us see progress. Another meaningful metric is business outcomes, which I talked about before. So just as an example, we've seen a lot of learning platforms be able to now do some integration with business platforms. So think about Salesforce. And if you have a team of salespeople and you have a learning intervention and you want to see if it actually improves the KPIs that those salespeople are measured on, well, you can do that if what you can do is see what it looked like before, right? What was their time to close beforehand, or what was their success rate beforehand? And then you have them take the learning intervention. And then you look at those KPIs again in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And that at least starts to make a straight line. Now, it may not be the only factor, of course, because that learning intervention is one thing, but it's not everything. But what it means is that, first of all, companies need to be more intentional about those things. And then secondarily, they need to put more emphasis on the tools, the practices, the behaviors around doing that stuff. So building in time for people to learn, building in time and spaces for communities of practice to evolve and emerge, so that when I'm learning this new thing, I don't feel like I'm the only one that's doing it. I feel like I can call you up and say, hey, Rebecca, I'm trying to do this thing and you already know how to do it. Can you help me? That kind of communication is really important in terms of signaling as an organization that you have a learning culture.
You mentioned building in time for people to learn and how like the direct manager is probably the best person to kind of see like, whether or not an employee has learned a new skill and if they're putting it into use. How can direct managers maybe, make that room for people to learn or, provide space for them to feel like psychologically safe to try something? And it maybe it's a real project, but maybe it's also something like this, working in a sandbox to try those out before they start applying them to production environments.
Yeah, so there's two things. First of all, One of the first questions that I ask when any organization comes to me and says we're having trouble with skills development, I say, is it a performance metric? Do people have skills development goals that are being measured in a meaningful way? And the answer often is no, or yes, but it doesn't count for anything. So from how you get people to do stuff, if you don't care about it, if it doesn't count for anything, people do what they're being paid to do. They do what they're being measured on first. It doesn't mean they never do anything else. It just means they do those two things first. And the outcome of that is anything else gets deprioritized when something shows up on the doorstep that falls under those first two buckets. So when I say that managers need to make time, the first thing they need to do is make it a priority, because you can't allocate time to it unless it's defined as a priority. And then the second piece is, we are really good organizationally at adding to people's plates. So I think most of us were hired with a job description, and like the first 6 months, we really felt like we had a reasonable set of goals and things to achieve. And then what happens? Well, Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws, can you also make soup? Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws and making soup, can you also go mow the lawn? Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws, making soup, mowing the lawn, can you also walk the dog? Right? That's how jobs evolve. And the problem is it becomes unsustainable. And we never go back and say, you know what, you don't have to juggle the chainsaws anymore. So part of what a manager needs to do is be really clear on what people are doing, how heavy their workload is, and intentionally remove or deprioritize things in order to create this space to do the things that are most important, to be able to know how to be successful, and to be able to be inefficient at something while you're learning. So if it's going to take someone who's perfect at a skill an hour to do something, you're probably going to assume that it's going to take me, who's not yet perfect at that, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours. But if you're still only allocating an hour for that task because that's how much time the expert takes to do it, you're not creating the space that people need to learn, and they're going to default to only doing the things they know how to do really, really well.
I do feel like juggling chainsaws is probably one of those things you have to be perfect at from the start, though.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of room for personal injury in that
But
example.
that's a good example. You know, it's funny we joke about it, but when I talk about safe spaces to learn, a lot of times, like, let's think about an example of a company that's in the financial services industry. Now, if they have a value that says we fail and we learn from failure. Oh, but if that failure is breaking compliance regulations or failing with your client's money, that's just not okay. And so the juggling chainsaws example, I think, is a space where, as managers, if I wanted to teach someone to juggle chainsaws, I might start out with having them juggle foam chainsaws that aren't running until they're really, really good at that before I would let them juggle a non-running regular chainsaw, or however you do it. But part of a manager's job, and you mentioned the idea of a sandbox before, is how do we create some defined spaces to fail safely, and to say the consequence for this failure is not that we're going to lose our customers' money. It's not that we're going to end up on the front page of the New York Times, right? This is a safe place for you to take a risk. And then we build that tolerance up as people's skills develop in an aligned way. But I think sometimes that messaging around learning by failing comes without that caveat of, yes, but we have to do that safely.
All right. Really, really good stuff. You did mention earlier in your example that, you're learning a new skill. You reach out to me because I might happen to know something about that. That's a really nice segue into our next discussion point, which is, why is having access to subject matter experts so critical to closing skill gaps?
Yeah, I think it's tempting to say anyone can learn something just by taking a course or by figuring it out or by experimenting, but it often takes longer to learn something. And I think sometimes we've seen that in our own experiences. I always use the example of public speaking as something that is really easy to see some of these different elements, right? I can take a public speaking class. I can read a book about becoming a great speaker, but what's really helpful to me is watching TED Talks, because I'm watching someone who's really good at this do it. And that helps me see not only how to do it well, but different ways of doing it well. So one of the things that subject matter experts help you do is take that learning, that theory, and show you how it actually works, show you different ways that they have tried to do it, and help you see how you might do it differently yourself. Because all of us, I think, develop our own styles of things. So I don't speak the same way Barack Obama speaks, but we both speak for a living. And so I think it's really important to be able to contextualize that skill with how I personally apply and deliver it. And the best way for me to do that is to see different people who have expertise and how they approach it. The same is true in sports. And I think we know some of these things intuitively when we look at sports. So if you were going to learn to be a basketball player, you would hire a coach who was a subject matter expert to help you get better at that. If you were going to learn to play golf, you could only get so far by doing it yourself. At some point, you need someone who's an expert to correct certain aspects of what you're doing, and that's what helps your learning process progress. So I do think having subject matter experts is really important. With that said, it's also something that companies struggle with, because those are the most highly valued people in many cases to do the work. And so if you have a subject matter expert and then they're spending half of their time supporting or mentoring or teaching people, they're not spending half of their time doing work. So you could look at that as an inefficiency. Oh no, we have this person and they're only efficient 50% of the time. But if they're lifting 10 other people up who are then going to become your next subject matter experts, and you're making those 10 people that much more efficient and effective in their learning process, then that's actually a great investment of their time. But I think a lot of companies don't do that math. They just look at that time as either lost time, or they just make it additive. So they tell that subject matter expert, yeah, do your whole job 100% and also support these 47 people over here who are learning. And that's just not sustainable. So there's a time element there as well.
I think it does become inefficient though when it's always like one-on-one, like mentoring and aspects with other employees. You know, what do you think companies can do to like change that from like subject matter expert to one mentee, more to a one-to-many kind of learning transfer?
There's a couple of ways to do that. So one way I mentioned before is this idea of a community of practice. So if you have 10 people who are learning the same skill and you have one subject matter expert and they have some sort of structured way to ask questions, share information, then you start to stretch that one-to-many relationship in a more efficient way. The second way, and this is where technology can be helpful, is let's imagine that subject matter expert is doing something and they know that it's something that these folks are trying to learn because they've heard from them. So maybe they do a quick screen recording using a technology and they voice it over and they say, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, right? And then that becomes an artifact. It becomes a piece of content that's useful for a lot of people, and it reduces the questions that come back to that subject matter expert. So it is about finding ways to make that interaction more efficient, but it is also important to make sure that there's that sort of human to human interaction there, because if you get too far away from that, it starts to become harder for people to connect to and understand what they're trying to figure out.
It sounds like a really good balance there, right? You know, you have this artifact that is around, it's available for people who aren't necessarily like maybe in the same time zone, or maybe come to the team after that subject matter expert has been there a while. But at the same time, just being able to reach out and ask questions and say, hey, I saw this video you did, or I was looking at the code you wrote, going back to like that public speaking, example, right? And your style is completely different. I'm intrigued. Not only is it different, maybe it's more efficient, can you walk me through that example? Because it's not how I would approach it. So.
Right. No, exactly.
All right. Maybe we can go ahead and move on to the next question that we have. Yeah, you talked earlier about those four shocks. The systemic risk that's out there, whether it's pandemic or climate change, were kind of the examples you use that maybe can't be predicted. Some of those other shocks that are out there. I think you mentioned the Great Resignation, or Great Reshuffle. Right? There are some people that are leaving the workforce, but most of them are moving to other companies. How does enabling continual skill building reduce risk to a business?
Yeah, so I think when we think about risks, there are a bunch of risks that we try to mitigate. And retention is certainly a risk we're always trying to mitigate, right? If we spend a lot of time and effort and money hiring someone, we want them to stay for a certain period of time, but we don't want them to just stay. We want them to stay and be engaged and do really great work. And so skill building does two things. First of all, it helps us because people want to learn and grow. We hear this all the time when we look at reasons why people leave organizations. Career development is almost always at the top of the list for why people leave an organization, is because they don't feel like there are opportunities for them to learn and grow. So by creating really good foundational skill development paths and plans for people, you're helping to mitigate that risk. The second risk that we try to mitigate is the risk of not having the right talent to do the work we're trying to do. If you have an empty seat because you can't hire a person to do that work, then that work may not be getting done, or you may have to hire a really expensive piece of external talent, whether that's a freelancer or a contractor or someone like that, to come in and do that work because you don't have the ability to do it in-house. So the gap between your strategy and the execution of that strategy a lot of times rests on and is grounded on this idea of having the right skills. The other piece is continuous learning helps you be a more resilient organization when change happens. So when you have some kind of systemic risk event and you need people to change their behavior, if they are used to a very rigid environment where they know exactly what they're supposed to do every day and nothing ever changes and they don't have to learn anything new, it becomes really hard to shift gears and say, no, wait, everything's different. Now we have to change. Now we have to evolve. If we're in that habit, if we're flexing that muscle all day, every day of growth and development and learning, it becomes easier then to shift and turn the boat as different things come to play that change your strategy or that change your goals or that change your outcomes. So I think there are a lot of ways that skills development, that career development, that learning help you as an organization progress. I also still think that there are risks you can't mitigate. So there are some things that are going to happen that you can't control. And so you do your best to understand what those are. But at the end of the day, part of the idea of having a workforce that is continuously in the state of development is what helps you deal with unexpected risks.
I'm going to revisit some of the statistics that we shared earlier today, and one of them was that 12% of employees say they leave for more money, and that 53% would consider leaving a company for an opportunity to learn. Now, there are the FANG companies out there, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles, that have a ton of money that they can throw at employees and lure them away. Do you think this opportunity to learn in this continual learning environment, is that enough to offset it for companies that just can't compete on the money?
Yeah, in some cases it has to be, right? So if you look at an Amazon, and they recently announced that they had a cap, a salary cap, and by that I mean a base compensation cap of $160,000 a year. And they recently elevated that to $350,000 a year. And now that's an astonishing amount of money, first of all, just to, raise the roof. And part of that was because they were experiencing what a lot of organizations are experiencing right now, which is technology talent is limited. It was before the pandemic. That isn't new to us who've worked in tech for a long time, that tech talent was hot and has been hot for a long time. And they wanted to use the lever that they had to pull in order to attract and retain their talent, because we're all competing now with a global marketplace. Because in a lot of cases, tech talent is industry agnostic. I can work in financial services as a tech person just as easily as I can work in a high-tech company, just as easily as I can work in a retail company. And so you have this really broad spectrum of organizations competing with each other for the same talent all the time. And yes, money is a factor, but it's not the only factor. And there are always going to be companies you can't compete with because of money. But you have other levers that you can think about. And career development and learning is certainly a powerful one. But there are some other levers too, I think, that we want to look at. When you go all the way back to that Google research and the idea of psychological safety, I think culture matters a lot, especially now in terms of where people choose to work. They want to know that they're coming into an organization that behaves in a trustworthy manner, that communicates transparently, that supports their desire for work-life balance, that supports their career development and growth. So when you're looking to retain talent, I think the ability to develop and learn and grow is a really powerful lever and tool, but it also has to come with, yes, we're going to give you that opportunity to learn and grow, and we're not going to do that as additive to all of the other things that we're going to ask you to do, which ultimately will burn you out. And so I think when we see our organizations and our clients trying to solve this problem, they are looking at it through all of those different lenses and saying, which of these is our biggest asset as an organization, and how can we play to our strengths instead of trying to compete dollar for dollar with some of these organizations that have deeper pockets.
I think it's also really important to look at, like, this idea of developing your bench of talent too, right? So when you have this continual learning environment, when you reward learning, when you make time for it, right? You have more space to hire, junior developers, junior technologists, junior product people, right? And really train them and bring them up, and help them grow their careers. And then, maybe they are like more embedded in that culture. What do you think about that?
I do. I think it is a practice that takes discipline. I see over and over again organizations who have a knee jerk of, we can hire a person for this job. And they have in their head this perfect person that's sitting somewhere waiting for their call, who has all of the hard skills, all of the soft skills, all of the leadership skills, all of the business acumen, and is going to show up on the doorstep and just make everything perfect. Those people don't exist. So when you have people in the organization who know the culture, who know the processes, who have a really strong network within the organization, but they don't have the skills they need to do the work, I think we see them as a more concrete risk because we know them. And so we know the risk we're taking. Whereas hiring that person from outside feels like less of a risk, but is actually more of a risk. We don't know if they're going to come in and adapt to our culture. We don't know if they're going to have the aspirations and attributes that we really need. And we're going to spend a lot of time and effort going out and talking to a lot of people to try to uncover those people that we think are going to solve all our problems. So I do think it feels a little bit viscerally risky to take a more junior person and put them in a more senior role rather than hiring externally. But once you do it a few times, I think you start to get into the habit of it and you recognize what you really need to do to support those folks. And if you do it well, it has a lot of really good knock-on effects because people see those internal opportunities for promotion. They see that career growth and development, and they see that that jump is not so, that bar is not so high that it's not possible for them to get over it. And I think that's a really important piece. I still think people are going to try and hire unicorns because, that's sort of how we are. But I would just encourage you to think about that longer term process of, as you said, developing that bench of talent so that you have talent at the ready before you need it, rather than being in a position of asking someone to make a really big jump because they're not really ready, which doesn't set them up for success and doesn't set you up for success.
I think even, somebody who's coming in as that unicorn, right? Like, it's important for them to take a look at that company and see how they're supporting their current employees, right? So what is the career growth for, their teammates? Why are they looking outside? Why aren't they training the people that they have? Or, is it just the skill gap right now that still needs to be closed? So I think those are perfectly valid questions for, an employee coming in, whether they're whether they're, in that development phase or they are that unicorn, right? So,
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about how important this is, what employees get out of it, what employers get out of it. That brings me to my next question, which is, whether you're the employee or the manager, how do you convince your organization and build the case that these kinds of projects should be funded?
Yeah, so we have a couple of data points on this, which I will go to in a second. But my answer to this is I don't know that you need to make the business case. I feel like the business case is there. And the reason I say that is if we go to the next slide, what we see in the marketplace is when we ask executives about skills development, they almost universally say, yeah, skills development is a really big problem and it's putting our business strategy at risk that we can't get the people we need to execute on our business strategy. So I don't feel like we need to go to leaders with our hat in our hands and say, pretty please with sugar on top, help us do learning. I think most executives are already on that bus. The problem that we see is twofold. The first is in many organizations, learning belongs to, and I do that with air quotes because learning belongs to all of us, but learning is measured by and often controlled by HR. And that's because part of skills development and career development is an HR responsibility. And there are a lot of really good reasons to have some centralized viewpoints. And also because HR folks tend to be pretty steeped in the science of learning and the science of development and know some of those things. But if you go to the next slide, the challenge is that our HR folks are really busy right now with a lot of critical priorities. We've got this issue with retention. We have issues with engagement. We have DEI work going on. We have workforce well-being issues and burnout. We have compliance. We have a lot of stuff happening. And the challenge is, with all of those things going on, reskilling and upskilling falls down the priority list, which is not to say HR doesn't care about it, because they really do. I come from an HR background and most of my network is HR folks. And what I hear from them is that they're struggling to try to find the ways to do all of these things. And it's hard. And so the result of that, the outcome of that, is that some of the responsibility for this starts to fall on the lines of business. The lines of business are the ones stepping up to the plate and saying, okay, it's 6th, 7th, 8th on your priority list, but it's the top of our priority list. So we need to figure this out. So what I always say is, I think this needs to be collaborative in a really meaningful way, that HR brings some very important viewpoints and perspectives and also some tools and resources and knowledge to the table. But the lines of business also need to come to the table with an approach and with a commitment for that time, that coaching culture, those things that they're going to do to make this work. And that in turn is what creates that overall strategy that works. So I haven't really seen organizations struggle to get funding when they have that good comprehensive plan that says, we know what we're trying to achieve, we know what metrics it's going to impact, we have a strategy for really making this work. I don't think any executive is going to push you out of the room when you try to make that case. But I think when you just throw a statement of work on the table, or you throw a purchase order on the table and say, we want to buy a this or we want to buy a that, I would question that as an executive. Okay, you want to buy a that? What are you going to do with it? How is that going to work? And so that goes back to all the things we've talked about before, about applied learning, about learning culture, about the manager's role, about all these other things that underpin the success of those technology investments to mean that they actually produce a learning outcome that's valuable to the organization.
Reskilling, upskilling here being like second to last on this list of priorities for HR is really eye-opening. I do want to dig a little bit into that kind of like, how can we enable like that collaboration and help departments be self-sufficient in their learning. But looking at time, I do want to leave time for Q&A. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. So from my perspective, I am here from Stack Overflow. I do want to talk about how Stack Overflow for Teams helps build a learning culture. This is the technology that can help enable those departments, have those micro learning moments in between each other, break down silos and, share knowledge. So, here's some of the ways that Stack Overflow for Teams helps. For challenges that are staring you in the face and you need to quickly understand something that you didn't anticipate needing to know beforehand. Stack Overflow for Teams provides just-in-time knowledge because you can search, the questions and answers that others have asked for you, and solve that immediate need. We've talked about needing to, create an internal community that embraces knowledge sharing. HR is not going to be able to do it on their own. And this internal community not only embraces knowledge sharing, but connects knowledge seekers with subject matter experts. So gives them that access throughout the company, even if they've never met in real life. So employees feel safe asking questions, experts find meaning in mentoring coworkers, establishing their reputation as knowledgeable in their domain areas, and helps reinforce that one-to-many learning that we talked about earlier, so that subject matter experts can mentor, but it's not taking up all of their time away from their day jobs. Finally, Stack Overflow for Teams embraces and supports that continual learning culture. Katy mentioned creative work earlier. Here, employees solve challenges outside of their very strict job description, so it gives them freedom to explore, to learn, to grow their skill sets, and also make connections with each other that can lead to higher job satisfaction and employee retention as well. So at this time, let's go ahead and see what kind of questions we have from the audience. All right, so I'd like to go ahead and grab some of the questions that we're getting in from Slido. The first of which is, you use both soft and hard skill examples, Katy, like public speaking, TED Talks, and versus new programming languages. Is a continual learning culture better at one type of skill set than the other?
I would say no. I think that both hard skills, soft skills, any kind of skills that you're trying to learn have the same process, right? Adult learning theory applies in both of those cases. I think what we tend to focus on is hard skills, ironically, because hard skills are easier. And a lot of that is because they're more measurable sometimes. And soft skills can be harder to figure out how somebody's progressing and to measure and to do some of those things. But no, I think learning culture applies across any type of skill that you're trying to learn, capability that you're trying to learn. And I think when we're too rigid about defining what a skill is, sometimes we get lost in that rigidity of trying to have exact competencies and mapping exact skills within those competencies, rather than sort of seeing learning as a journey and a progression.
All right. The next question is, are there generational differences in employee expectations for how much employers should invest in development?
That's a funny question. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of preamble thoughts before I answer that question. First of all, in general, as a general rule, I think you need to be really careful with generational generalizations, because especially, and this happened especially with the millennial generation, that a whole bunch of generalizations were made about them. And of course, the millennial generation is a massive cohort of people. So you took a set of expectations and applied that to a massive cohort of people. And of course, it was wrong for a whole lot of people. So so we want to be careful anytime that we make generalizations. The second thing I'll say is, it's not so much that expectations of talent have changed so much as companies have evolved in how they perceive learning and how they see value in that, and how they have approached learning. So companies have learned about learning. So if I think back to many, many years ago when I started in the workforce, this was this expectation that, first of all, I was going to come with certain skills. And if I wanted to change careers, which I did, that I needed to, on my own time, take classes on my own nickel and then come to the table with those new skills. And that was what would make me qualified. And we saw a lot of organizations do that. And even up until today, I still get asked the question, why should we give people time to learn during work? Shouldn't they be doing that on their own time? And I think what we've seen over time is that strategy doesn't make sense, because yes, people are going to learn on their own time, but they're not going to necessarily learn the things you want them to learn. And it also means that people feel like there's this double burden and their employer is not supporting them. And so what you see when you see people leaving because of a lack of career development is, if the messaging is you have to do this yourself with your own money, with your own time, then yeah, it's perfectly reasonable to say my company's not supporting my career development. And it became a competitive advantage for organizations to say, no, we'll teach you. No, you can learn here. No, we will help fund this because it has value to both of us. So I would say it's less of a generational difference and more of an evolution of talent strategy, as well as an evolution of availability of learning experiences, again, that could be more integrated into your daily work.
We talked earlier about managers supporting their employees and learning time and setting aside time and protecting it. One of our questions is, Google's known for their 20% rule, where they set aside like 1 day a week for employees to experiment. There's been some news reporting that maybe employees are now evolved into 120% rule, where it's in addition to full-time hours. How can leaders implement and protect this learning exploration time for employees?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because there's a continuous demand for time. So time is really, in a lot of ways, the only thing we cannot make more of. And so because of that, and I mentioned this before when I was talking about prioritization, and what we measure gets done, what we pay people to do gets done. So the first thing that managers need to do is make sure that career development goals are part of those performance metrics, because that's how we make sure we can protect that time, because it becomes something that's measured. The second thing is, it's a discipline. I also do a lot of work with organizations on culture. And culture is what we do. So the values, and maybe the things that are printed on the wall and the pretty pictures that are on our corporate website, on our About Us page, right? Those are our values. And, Enron had beautiful values, Theranos had beautiful values, but what we do is the actual day-to-day activities and behaviors. So if what we say is we value learning and we'll support you, but what we do is write over your calendar every time you make a block to try and learn something, well, that tells me something. That tells me about how you as an organization prioritize learning or don't. And so I think it's important as a manager to be really conscious when you're making that decision, to ask someone to remove or move a block that they've dedicated to learning, or to write over that you're sending a message every time you do that.
What's the balance between the culture aspect of it and the enabling platforms for learning? Can one succeed without the other, or do you really need both?
In my opinion, you need both. And part of that is because you need the measurement from the platform as much as you need the platform's ability to deliver content, right? Platforms give you data, and that data is really useful in making the ROI case and being able to say how much is happening. So they feed each other, and you need to have the learning culture in order for the platform to be effective. And you need the platform in order to be able to measure the learning and to continue to do it and to grow from it. So I think you need both.
Okay. This question is, do you think the pandemic has had either a net positive because there's more access to virtual and async opportunities to learn, or a negative, there's not that in-person opportunity for different types of learning styles, impact on employee upskilling? So positive or negative, or kind of and balance there.
Yeah, I would say it's a little column A, a little column B. So the net positive is that in a virtual scenario, a lot of us have the opportunity to access learning and do things like that. But we did that before the pandemic too, in most cases. There are a lot of organizations that converted learning to virtual, or converted it to virtual instructor led during the pandemic. the biggest problem that I see, an obstacle to learning, is when we're on Zoom all day long, when we are in these video sessions all day long. It's draining, and it's differently draining than being in physical meetings all day long. There was a really excellent National Geographic article that I was reading that basically says, look, as human beings, prolonged eye contact is exhausting. And yet that's what we do on Zoom all day in order to demonstrate that we're paying attention. We stare at the little camera, which is actually not a human being, it's a little camera. And so I'm looking at my camera, I'm not really looking at you, Rebecca. It would be much easier on my brain if you and I were sitting in a room having this conversation. So because it's exhausting, what happens is that learning thing becomes one more exhausting thing. And if our brains are exhausted, we have a much harder time absorbing new information and being able to try new things. So that part of it is harder. And to me, I think what that tells us is we need to be able to have shorter chunks of formal learning and more opportunities for trying things and doing things that don't involve just sitting and staring at a screen for another hour or half hour or whatever as part of the day. So I think there's net positives and net negatives.
We're kind of, exemplifying the worst of both aspects right now, right? We're running long and we're staring at little cameras, but I'm learning so much from you today. So thank you so much for like overcoming Zoom fatigue to spend time with us.
Yeah, this is fun.
The next question is, what kind of rewards should we think about related to learning and upskilling or reskilling?
That's a great question. So I want to start out by talking about what kind of rewards you don't want to do. So learning is creative work. And one of the things we know about creative work is it's motivated differently. Creative work is motivated by intrinsic motivation, love of the work. We do creative work because we want to, because we're learning to do it, because it feels good and meaningful for us to do it. So competition has a negative impact on our motivation to do creative work. If I feel like I'm competing with you, Rebecca, and I don't know how to do something, then I'm going to feel less confident in doing it, which ultimately is going to cause me to feel less motivated to do it. Yet, what do we see in a lot of learning programs? We see leaderboards. And so the first thing that I'll say is when you're trying to reward learning, rewards need to be self-progression. You don't want to introduce competition against one another. You don't want to make it who can be the fastest to get to this point, because ultimately some people will opt out when you do that and just say, forget it, I don't want to play. And other people will play really hard to win, but not to learn. And so I think when we're thinking about rewards, what we're really thinking about is, again, aligning the what's in it for you and what's in it for me. In some ways, learning is its own reward. And having the opportunity to learn and the access to learn and grow is a reward in and of itself. The second reward is, hey, if I level up my skills and I can get a new job that pays me more money, that's a reward. So I don't think you necessarily need to think about it from the standpoint of, am I going to give somebody a badge for spending an hour doing an e-learning? But I do think we want to recognize people's efforts, and we want to make sure that we're continuously making it visible within the organization that this is a good thing, that we value this, that this person took this time and did this thing, and that was meaningful to them, and it's meaningful to us as an organization. So that's how I would think about rewards and recognition around learning. And I think it's definitely something a lot of organizations are struggling with and trying to figure out how to do.
I'm going to flip that for a second. We were talking about rewards for the employee who was learning. What about rewards to encourage people to mentor? We talked about how important access was to subject matter experts. How do we get them out of the mindset of knowledge hoarding and more into the mindset of knowledge sharing?
Yeah, so this one is tricky. First of all, I always say, it's sort of like leadership. And we've done this for years in tech, right? We've taken these wonderful, smart, talented individual contributors and said, you're great at this, you should be a team leader. And that person had zero interest in leading a team and didn't really want to do it, but we made them do it because that's the next progression for more money or whatever. The same thing is true about learning. when you have people mentoring or coaching or being subject matter experts, it's really important that they want to do that. You might have the best subject matter expert in the world, but if they don't want to do that, they're going to find passive aggressive or aggressive aggressive ways to do it badly in order to not have to do it. And that's just a fight you can't win. So the first thing you want to do is really identify the folks who want to do that work, and then make that part of their role so that you're not asking them to cannibalize the time that they need to do other things. You're not making it additive. You're really incenting them and rewarding them by giving them space to do something that they want to do, and then recognizing them for doing that work as well.
I think there's a middle ground there, right? So Stack Overflow, whether you're talking about the public site or private instances, right? There's this aspect of being recognized as the expert, right? And you get that by sharing knowledge. And it does happen in a way that is async. So it's not, forcing people to, don't want to be mentors necessarily sitting down and doing pair programming or something like that takes up that kind of time. They can do it like, as it fits into their regular day. So there is some middle ground there.
Yeah, totally.
The next question is, how can companies give entry-level hires the learning support they need to rapidly progress their careers?
So there's a couple of strategies for this. And again, I think it's about intentional design. So one strategy, I'll just give as an example, is a rotational strategy. If you bring someone in the door into a role and you expect them to stay in that role for 3 years or 5 years. And I mentioned before, I don't necessarily like bucketing people by generation, but I will say there is sometimes value in understanding life stage and different things that we want in different stages of life. So if you hire entry-level talent, oftentimes they're still in an exploratory phase. Do I like this? Is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? And part of that is wanting to try lots of new things. So we hear all the time the sort of the kids these days, and I've been hearing that since I was the kids, which is, well, they want to be promoted within 6 months, or they want this, they want that. And the truth is, what new to market talent wants is opportunities to try things and to say, I like this, I don't like this. And so a rotational strategy is a really good way to do that, to say, we're going to bring you into this organization and we're going to start you off in a software development role or an infrastructure role or an analyst role or whatever. And you're going to do that for 6 months. And then you're going to rotate into this other role. And in each of those roles, you're going to have the opportunity to say, yes, I really like it, or nope, I really hate it. And you're going to have the opportunity to say, hey, this is interesting to me. I want to try more of this. And so making it a designed and intentional strategy means it doesn't feel jarring when 6 months in, that person says, I don't like this anymore, and has to go take another job outside your organization. So what you're doing is creating planned churn internally to keep that talent, rather than unplanned churn because you're asking someone to do something that inherently it's pretty unlikely they're actually going to want to do. Now, are there people who get in their first jobs and stay there for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? I'm sure there are. But for the most part, incoming talent really doesn't do that. The average tenure in the early parts of our career is quite short. We don't get up to 5, 7 years until we're mid-career professionals.
Yeah, I'll take a step back there. One thing I think when we talk about entry-level talent is not just like younger employees, right? It's those career changes as well. And then, that idea of the rotational programs. I hope it's more common again. It used to be common. When I worked at Motorola, we had Motorola University that everybody went through. And it's exciting too, right? You might be in something for a few months but you're like, oh yeah, no, I don't like that. But it's a good learning experience. So
right. But it also
appreciate that.
helps you internally network, which I think is something that you don't do if you stay in the same space. And so there are a lot of really good benefits to that mobility strategy.
And that's harder today, right? With the pandemic and remote, everybody working remotely, right? You're not encountering people in the hallway. So those experts that are sitting in other departments or other silos, right? They can be a little bit harder to reach without, the level of support, both culture and tech to figure out who you need to talk to.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, um, when we talked about HR and HR is a little bit stressed right now and burdened by, both retention and attracting talent and budget and everything else, how can we help departments become self-sufficient in their learning?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I guess the first thing I'll say is I don't expect departments to necessarily be totally self-sufficient. So one of the things that we see in big organizations is this sort of pendulum swing back and forth with who owns learning at any given time. So what happens is organizations see value in centralizing learning, and they create a center of excellence, and that center of excellence is responsible for buying learning technology and also responsible for working with other parts of the business. And the immediate complaint there is, well, that's great, efficiency is wonderful, but you don't understand us, you don't know what we do, you don't know what we need. And so then what happens is learning moves back down into the line of business, and we see learning specialists being hired down in the various lines of business and learning content being created. And then what do we hear? Spending's too dispersed. We don't have control over anything. We're spending redundantly in all these. Why do we have 16 leadership development programs, right? So there's tension there. And I don't think either party can do it on their own. It needs to be collaborative. So your HR folks, your learning specialists, your learning center of excellence is a hugely important resource to making sure that you're doing learning in a meaningful way. But the lines of business really know and understand a lot of the skills they're trying to develop, have deep knowledge and subject matter expertise in those skills. And so that's important in order to create the right program at the right time for the right person. So in my eyes, it has to be a collaboration. It has to be a relationship and a continuous dialogue, and not just one or the other. With that said, lines of business need to spend some time understanding a little bit more about how learning works so that they can understand how to design learning programs right. And I say this in the same way that I say that HR professionals need to understand what's happening in the lines of business, right? We both need to talk to one another and do a better job of building those bridges and sharing common language and making sure that we can communicate with one another. Otherwise, it just becomes a, that's not my problem, that's your problem, it's not my fault, it's your fault. And that just doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, blame cultures doesn't help, right? So we all kind of have to do our own part to lift everybody up. Has the longevity of new skills decreased in today's workplaces compared to say a decade ago?
That's a tough question to answer. There are some skills that are very durable. And so if you look at the whole organization, there are certain skills across an organization that are durable. And then there are some skills that come and go. We were talking earlier about the certification process, right? And the certifications I have in technologies that we haven't seen for years. That there are skills that evaporate really rapidly. And so to me, I think you need to understand when you're investing in skills development, what this skill you're investing in is and how long you think it's going to last. And there's actually some risk calculus you want to do there, right? Which is, what is the risk that we invest in this skill and then we don't need it anymore? And sometimes, and to go all the way back to the no more jobs model that I was talking about before, that's a better application of pulling someone in as a freelancer, pulling somebody in from the gig economy, pulling somebody in who has that discrete skill that you need right now for a really short period of time, and then you're not going to need it anymore, rather than trying to get that skill in-house. So I think we need to think carefully about when we upskill versus when we buy. We use a model we talk about here, you've probably heard, which is build, borrow, buy, bot. So you can build skills in-house, you can borrow them from partners, you can buy skills on the open marketplace, or you can automate and use technology to do certain things. And I think we tend to err on the side of, let's just go hire someone who can do that. And if we can't hire someone who can do that, let's just train somebody who can do that. And I think we need to make better choices about which is the right tool in the toolbox to get that thing accomplished.
Yeah, I think automation is a particularly powerful tool when we're talking about things that are repetitive and doesn't necessarily require the same level of a human brain that's more creative and can address different things. So that's definitely an aspect. We are so over time, Katie. So I'm gonna ask one more question. Thanks everybody who's stayed around. Is there any data on the link between employee engagement and having learning opportunities?
So this one is a little tricky, and I always talk about data around engagement as being this sort of multi-headed monster, right? Because we can look at engagement and we can see it rise and fall. We can see a lot of different things, and we can look at things that impact engagement. And certainly learning and development is a thing that impacts engagement. But there are a ton of things that impact engagement. And so it's much harder to really boil it down and say, 2 hours of learning and development opportunities per week versus 3 hours is going to change your engagement level by 6.8%, right? It's just there, you can't get to that discrete level of data. So there's two things I always recommend. First of all, I think we spend a lot of time doing this grass is greener stuff, which is we want to go look at what other people are doing, right? The grass is greener on the other side of the fence. This other company must be doing this better than we are. They must be smarter than we are. There must be a data point out there. It's the same thing I said before about trying to hire unicorns. So rather than spending time trying to get the exact data that tells you, how many hours a week is the right number of hours, is it Google's 20% number? Is it 5%? Is it 50%? It's so much more important to know your employees and to do work with your own sentiment analysis and listening programs to say who needs what and who feels really good about the resources and the tools that they have versus who's struggling and how do we support those folks who are struggling. So I always suggest that you take a bespoke approach to figuring out how much learning you need and who needs it and when they need it and all of those things, rather than trying to sort of do a broad brush one size fits all. So can I tell you that learning has a relationship with engagement? Yep, I can. Lots of good data on that. Can I tell you exactly how much learning is going to change your numbers? Nope, definitely not. But I think it's a good question to be asking and thinking about as you think about structuring your programs.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've hit a lot of topics today where there's a both answer, right? It's both culture and enabling technology. It's both mentoring and knowledge seeking. And it's both departments doing their part and HR doing their part for learning as well. So with that, I think we're going to close it today. Thank you so much for staying. It's always lovely talking to you. And thanks to our audience for all the great questions too.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you all so much.
Okay.